One of the things we came across on the documentary were so-called sickfluencers, people on TikTok who will basically give advice. There are 200,000 under 25s on sickness benefit. But the fastest rising age group for sickness benefit are the 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, there are now 500,000 of them. That's up by almost 65% over just 5 years. That is a staggering waste of human potential as well as economic.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Fraser Nelson. Fraser is the former editor of The Spectator and will be joining The Times in January. Fraser, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be here.
So, Fraser, you've just fronted a new Channel 4 documentary called Britain's Benefit Scandal. I remember seeing some of your Spectator pieces, I think from about 2 years ago, where you spoke about the fact that there are, a fifth of the adult working population in Manchester on out-of-work benefits. There are now upwards of 3 million people on long-term sickness benefits. And I remember when I first saw it, I sort of thought, surely this can't be the case. Surely this is not true. Could you tell us a little bit about why this is the case and where these numbers are actually coming from?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you had that reaction because that was always my figure. It was just, when you go to Manchester, it's a booming, thriving city and nobody would quite... If you said, look, actually 1 in 5 of the adults wandering around the city isn't out of work benefits, you wouldn't believe it. But there's job vacancies everywhere. We're desperate. There's a worker shortage crisis in Manchester. And then it's not just Manchester, it's the same in Birmingham, it's the same in Glasgow. When you go to Blackpool, it's 25%. When you go, so this is this sort of staggering. And when you look at it in any measure, 20%, or I think it's 18% in Manchester, that is a staggering waste of human potential as well as economic. And then you think, why does nobody care about this? Why is this uncontroversial? Now, I've been coming out with these figures so often as a journalist. You will have read them in The Spectator, leading articles, and some of my own colleagues ended up teasing me about having it on the sort of cut and paste kind of, 18% of Manchester, 19% of Birmingham, 20%. I would come up with these figures as if the very publication of them was enough to make a dramatic point, but they were just landing flat. Nobody seemed to care. And as a journalist, that sort of presents you with the dilemma, right? If you think people should care and they don't, usually you're not telling the story in the right way. What journalists are supposed to do is find out what matters, but then find interesting ways of engaging people. Now, when you look at those figures, the bulk of it is sickness benefit. So the majority of people in out-of-work benefits right now are in sickness. But it's 6 million people in Britain on that out-of-work benefits, of whom I think it's 3.3 million are on sickness benefits. And that number is rising fast. It was just over 2 million 5 years ago. Now, what is really helpful is that the DWP now does forecasts, and those forecasts say it's going to be 4 million within 5 years' time. So that is staggering. That's pretty much doubling the number of people on out-of-work benefits in a very short space of time. And when you look at the figures for sickness, it's not going up that level. So what is going wrong? Now, what I wanted to do in the documentary was to try to find a different way of telling this story, because I understand if it's just statistics, it's people like you and me in a studio reading this million, that million, and it kind of leaves people cold. But behind every single one of these statistics is a person. And usually that person's potential is not being used. And quite often they're dropped in this kind of maze of acronyms, of warped incentives. It's very difficult for them to get out. So what I wanted to do when I left Spectator was spend a lot of time trying to find the sort of people who could tell this story for themselves. I could tell as a journalist as well that they were being excluded from the conversation. When you're in sickness benefit, you disappear from the unemployment figures. It's a major flaw in the way that economics is reported on, because people think you're employed, you're unemployed, but no, there's a massive third way. But you're not just excluded from the economic figures, you're excluded from a national conversation as well. Nobody talks about you. You may as well not exist. Now, this is a vast chunk of our countrymen that we're writing off in this way. And you never hear from them, because if you look at all the various NGOs and charities in this sphere, their main concern is getting more people on to benefits. If you want to claim, there's no shortage of people willing to do that for you. Right now, there are homeless hostels that will do the paperwork for you, because then they get paid directly from the council. But if you want to get back into work, you're pretty much on your own. So because there's no organisations really speaking up for these people, it took quite a lot of work to go out to the various cities, to the soup kitchens, effectively, the kind of the churches that will give lunch clubs for people in need of that. Because when you're out of work, of course, there's isolation that follows that. You don't have colleagues. If you're struggling with mental health, then that can be even harder to struggle in isolation. So Channel 4 gave me this incredible opportunity of superb team of journalists who would go out there and find people to speak and let them do the speaking. And that's what we sought to do with the documentary.
It's really fascinating. And I think also one of the most important political and economic problems that are facing this country at the moment, what I found really striking about the documentary is that, yes, the conversation about how much taxpayer money was being spent on the welfare state did happen. That conversation did happen. But what was really highlighted is actually the fact that there are so many of these people that are wasting their human potential, and actually the system is actively incentivizing them to do so. So you spoke about this benefits trap. Could you explain what it is and why it is the case that we are incentivizing people to remain on long-term sickness benefits?
Well, crudely put, if you are in this sort of demographic, we're saying if you're trying to get a minimum wage job, then you've got two options. One is you can go for insecure, pretty hard work, breaking your back, stacking shelves, or working for an agency with not very much certainty. And by the way, not very much a chance of career progression now, because agencies have sort of mean that rather than being the bottom rung on the ladder, as Terry Leahy was when he was stacking shelves for Tesco before he went to be chief executive, you're not on the bottom rung of the ladder anymore. You're being shipped in by an agency and shipped out. So the changing nature of work makes this pretty tough and has made the kind of hope of being able to take it on by your own efforts dimmer. So that is the one door, if you like. However, walk through the other door here and be categorised as long-term sick, and you can get £1,300 to £1,400 a month fairly easily, perhaps more if you're a parent, and perhaps more if your kid is categorised as disabled. Then soon we're talking you can get a premium to the minimum wage and perhaps even to the average wage, depending how things go. Now, when you make this point, you're quite often accused of saying, are you saying people are being selfish, they're scamming the system? I'm not saying that for a minute. I'm just saying that when you look at the economic architecture of this country, I think it really matters. There are two Britons, if you like. There's the Britain where people know that the more work they put in, the more they will get paid, the more hours you work. There's a direct link between your efforts and your chance of success for most of us. But if you're at the bottom, that link is broken. You're in a system now where if you want, choose work, but you be mindful that you're probably getting less money than you would be if you're categorised as long-term sick. In the documentary, I speak to a window cleaner. He's getting about £400 a month, and his son was getting twice, three times that on sickness benefit. Now, you can understand if you're that window cleaner wandering around trying to do jobs for £10 a throw, not sure if you're going to get hired or not, thinking to yourself, God, this is really quite strange here. If I'm categorized as being too anxious or too depressed to work, because 70% of these claims involve mental health, then all of a sudden you can be financially a lot better off. Now, it takes a special sort of person, I think, to choose the lower paying option, to choose less money, to choose less security, because you've got a principled objection to involving yourself in the welfare state, especially if you're not scamming the state, because they wouldn't be. The people who are being approved for sickness benefits are quite often telling no word of a lie. Usually, they are just giving their exact experiences. And the way that some of them expressed it to me was like, I'm simply asking what's due to me. If the government is saying that if you're anxious, then you are due £1,300 to £1,400 a month, then why would you not take up that offer? Because, by the way, you can do up to 16 hours work on top of that as well. You can actually work even more than 16 hours so there are so many permeations of this system. But I think now, the other question, why is this happening? It's happening because people have simply lost sight of it. Nobody intended the system to be designed this way. When you look at what I'm talking about, these are all benefits that pile up on top of each other. Basic universal credit, then LCWRA, which is the sickness benefit, then the housing component, and then PIP for disability. And the PIP is about £7,000 a year in average, but that can be more or less depending on how you're categorized. Nobody ever sat down intended to make a system this way. This is simply how it's become through neglect and, in my opinion, through lack of care, lack of interest. As a country, we found it far easier to deal with these people at the bottom, if you like, by giving them a check and asking them to kindly just disappear. Because we have, in mass migration, a very good alternative. If you're a boss, then you can see in immigration people who are absolutely going to willing to turn up. They'll be, willing to work usually for lower salary. You're not going to have the problems that you would do if you're taking somebody who's been on unemployment benefit for a long time. So this puts me in a bit of a dilemma as a liberal, economic liberal. I would normally be in favour of mass immigration, but I have to accept right now that if employers have got this alternative, they're more likely to choose that than they are to put in the hard yards, taking in the ex-offenders or people who've been on the dole for 2 years. And so a large part of our economic social contract is being broken right now. And it's being broken in a way that wasn't intentional, but also isn't being discussed because these people are still, broadly speaking, invisible.
It's really fascinating, specifically with regard to the fact that people are talking about the fact that unemployment levels are really low. And those people are completely disappearing from the system, as you outlined in the documentary. And as you've been writing for many years. And that benefits trap, where people are going from effectively being able to work or being willing to work and then unable to do so. What I found really interesting about the documentary is those people that said, yes, I've been on benefits for quite a number of years, but now I want to go and work. And they were actively told by the job centre that if they did go and seek out work or they did try and seek out new educational opportunities, that they would then no longer be classed as long-term sick and all of those benefits would be taken away. I mean, as an economist, it's basic incentives, right? It's the system is incentivizing them to not go out and seek retraining. I think one of the guys was looking at doing a plastering course. And he's actively being told by the job centre, the very people that are supposed to be encouraging him back into work, that actually if he does try and seek out those educational opportunities, he would have all of those benefits taken away. And so he maybe shouldn't do so.
And you're right. The system could not be more perverse. The incentives couldn't be more perverse. And if you are actually unemployed and you commit to look for work, if you're facing sanctions, etc., you get significantly less money than if you say you're sick. If you get categorized as sick, your income doubles. Now, that should be the other way around. We should be, if anything, incentivizing people to go out to engage in the job search, and they can get sanctioned. And by the way, we don't get very much money on that system either. But so we are in a system where everybody I spoke to was absolutely terrified of engaging in this Kafkaesque system that they didn't trust, they didn't quite understand, and they felt that if they move, or if they do anything to draw the system's attention to them, then they could lose everything. Now, the other funny thing is technically they're not actually correct. The way it's supposed to work is that you are allowed to train, you are allowed to do a certain amount of work, but that message, whether it was communicated to them or not, they certainly didn't believe it. But it's also true, by the way, that you are at risk of reassessment. Now, they will have no faith at all that if they're reassessed, that they would pass that test. So whether it might not be technically true, they lose everything, but they would be at risk of being decategorized as long-term sick, and then they fear they would lose everything. What they need is a point of contact, a work coach or something similar, somebody to discuss with them, because everybody I spoke to desperately wanted out. They wanted to make something with their lives. I spoke to a guy who was barely 30 years old, and he was saying, look, I don't want to be written off yet. I've got so much of my life yet to live. And yet he had anxiety, and had been waiting a year for the mental health appointment the NHS has promised him. The welfare came soon enough, but the actual help he wanted wasn't coming anytime soon. So that's a system where we're very, very quick to write the check. We're very slow to think, what do you actually need? So often a course of CBT or talk therapy is what people need when they go through a very difficult time. You just need to, life gives you knocks. That's true if you're rich or poor. You will come across serious hardship in your life. Quite often you'll have mental health issues. And the question is, how do you respond to that? What's your support system like?
So do you think then part of the solution is solving the problems, the deep-rooted problems with the National Health Service? I mean, there are millions of people on waiting lists. We know that, for example, the child CAMS, the sort of the child mental health services, are incredibly overlisted. If people that want to get ADHD medication find it really difficult to do so, often they'd have to scrimp and save to go private in the first place. So do you think part of the solution is actually fixing the National Health Service and some of that those mental health services?
Well, I'll tell you something. And one of the things we came across on documentary were so-called sickfluencers, people on TikTok who will basically give advice. And it's not uncommon. I came across somebody who was charging £250 an hour for filling in your disability form. Now, you think, God, who's going to pay that money? There's QCs who charge less than that. But then again, when you think about the size of the award, there is an economic rationale in saying, look, I know how the system works. If you give me, I think if you wanted £750 for a 3-hour session, then you'll be able to reclaim your money in a couple of months. Maybe you will. Now, if the economics stack up for that, why wouldn't they stack up to give somebody talk therapy or CBT or whatever the intervention needs? Because it doesn't cost that much money. So absolutely, if we had a joined up government, which we don't, then we would be able to get these people money, which wouldn't cost that much. It would cost a hell of a lot less than putting somebody on sickness benefits for 6 months or a year. But government doesn't work that way. It's difficult morally to prioritize in a health service those who are on DWP waiting lists, right? Because that means that the sticks, NHS can't ration. It might make more sense for job centres to start to hire therapists and be able to do it not in the NHS but in something else. But we all know that those who are waiting for relatively cheap interventions, if they go private, if they can get the money, you can see a private GP for like 120 quid.
Yes.
That might not, obviously that can be a lot of money to some people, but the sort of interventions that they need are not very expensive and can be delivered more quickly. But nobody's really thinking about what these people need. That's the problem.
It's really shocking. When I was looking at some of these statistics myself, I found an NHS Confederation report that found that there are just over 63,000 people in the year 2021 to 2022 that went from being economically inactive because they were students to then being economically inactive because they're on long-term sickness benefits. So these are people that are my age. I left university in 2023, that go from being a student, being well enough to be a student, to then being entirely unable to work, or at least by the system being classified as such. I mean, that to me is not just incredibly shocking from that perspective, but so sad that there are 63,000 young people in a single year that are going from being a student to then being economically inactive on long-term sickness benefits. And we know the majority of that is mental health.
Absolutely. It is absolutely heartbreaking. I spoke to one of the welfare assessors whose job it is to say yes or no. And this is somebody who's still serving. She didn't want to go on camera, but she's a former GP. And she said that there's two things that break her heart. One is that the way that the system she's in incentivizes her to tick them off as a yes. So if you say no, you might get hold up because that person might sue, they might appeal. But if you say yes, no one's ever going to ask any questions. And you're literally paid more money the more assessments you get through. So the way to speed it up is to tick somebody off early in the assessment, say after 20 minutes rather than an hour. So that she knew that she tended to help people, but she didn't feel that she was ending up doing so. But the other thing she said that broke her heart was how many young people she's speaking to, how many people in their early 20s who've never worked, who say that they're struggling with anxiety or depression, and she has to go through the motions and tick them off. Now, when you look at the figures here, there are 200,000 under 25s on sickness benefit. But the fastest rising age group for sickness benefit are the 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, there are now 500,000 of them. That's up by almost 65% over just 5 years. So now given that the chances of coming off this are pretty low once you're on it for a certain amount of time, then the amount of life years that are being lost for the economy is really on another scale. When sickness benefits started, it pretty much was used under the Thatcher years by people who were working in factories that had closed down and they wanted to claim sickness. And there was an argument, okay, we're going to give these guys a transition to pension time, effectively early retirement. Now that, by the way, I didn't agree with that, but they were people that sort of towards the end, the second half of their careers. But when it's happening to people who are just finishing university, then you think there is something deeply, morally wrong with the system writing off so many young lives.
What's the solution? How do we solve it? How do we get Britain working again? And is it just purely solving the National Health Service problem that actually these people need those solutions itself? I know you mentioned potentially using all of that mental health support through areas like the job centre and actually doing it not through the NHS but through other systems. Or is there something more fundamental? Do we need to be a lot more harsh? Do we need to actually say, if you are deemed able to work and actually have better assessments, then you just have those benefits taken away? What do you think is the actual solution?
I'll tell you what I don't think will work. It's the kind of the crackdown, saying, okay, we're going to... I mean, it's so funny. The politicians seem to have only two languages on this. One is to not care about it at all and just write off pretty much 80% of those who ask. And the other is to say, we're going to crack down on these terrible people who are... Because it's not... I mean, that language is unhelpful. It's also inaccurate. These are people in very difficult situations who the government is incentivizing to choose one course of action over the other. It's the government's fault. The government is paving the road, and it shouldn't be surprised if people walk down the road to welfare dependency, especially if the road to work is so steep and so flinty and so heavily taxed and about to get even more taxed. So there are so many things that need to happen. Now, I think making work pay is one of them. But when you look around the world, you will see that no other country in the world is having this problem, not the way that we are. If you look since 2010, for example, Sweden's sickness benefit numbers have gone down by 50%. And Americas have gone down since the pandemic. So is Australia, so is Canada, so is Austria. And the IFS did a study on this, showing that basically Britain is, other than Denmark, which is also going up, but no other country we looked at is having anything like this problem. So when it comes to solutions, I'm actually quite relaxed about that, because you could throw a dart at a map and find a country that is doing a better job at this than we are. We just have to care about these people. We have to include them in the conversation and be honest about what we're doing to their communities and to their job prospects and to their economics. Now, when we discuss that and we grasp the full horror of what's happening right now, then finding a better solution shouldn't be easy, because it's pretty hard to find a worse one.
That's absolutely brilliant, Fraser. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in checking out Fraser's documentary, you can find it on the Channel 4 website, and we'll link it in the description below. And if you are interested in learning more about the IEA's work, consider joining the IEA Insider community on insider.iea.org.uk.